Please turn in your pew Bibles to page 1124 and follow along with me as I read our scripture. It is from John 11, verses 17 through 44. Page 1124. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into this world." And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe what you said, that you sent me." Then he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
Good morning. It was wonderful to see my daughter come up here and just see her just interacting with the other kids, and she reminds me so much of me when I was a kid. And I remember as a child when I was in Olympia, Washington, one day driving with my mom and her friend and looking out the window of the car and seeing this great big smokestack from this factory pouring out this fog into the sky. And I remember asking my mom, thinking that I had solved a kind of mystery, asking my mom if this is where the clouds came from. And of course the adults laughed. And they said, no, that's where the smog comes from. And then because I didn't know what smog was, I had then a whole host of new questions, a million more questions that they wished they had never answered. So we each have, I think, our own point of view. We each have our own perspective about our story and how our story and God's story fit together. We each have presuppositions about what we expect from God, what we expect from ourselves. And whether you're a reader or even a gospel writer, there's things about that story that we see that only we see. Things that others see that only they see. And it's hard to wade through that, to figure out which perspective is ours, which perspective is God's. There's a lot of beautiful things about John's gospel, and some of the things about John's gospel I really appreciate is his teachings are so plain. Things that are shrouded in mystery in the other gospels are just crystal clear in John. And so John shows us all the backwardness, all the disconnections between what was being revealed about who Jesus was and the perspectives of the people who followed him. He shows how far off the mark the disciples were, how far off the mark the Pharisees' perspective was, and even people like Martha and Mary. And it's not that they were probably any more dense than we are, or that we're any better than them. It's just different. They had different expectations about what God was going to do. They couldn't have imagined the things that we can imagine on the other side of the cross. Just like a little kid chasing the mystery of where the clouds come from. You know, they thought they had it all figured out. They thought they had solved this great riddle. And at that moment, they stopped being open for God to reveal more truth. In our time, I think we live in a world that's so skeptical, where it's cool to just not take a side and just dismiss everything, to be contrarians. A world that our post-scientific worldview has us believing that we can predict, explain, control almost anything about our lives. And miracles for a lot of people in our day are so 2,000 years ago. I think we live in an age where arrogance abounds. We can look back at the stories of human history and we can judge them by our standards rather than their standards. And we don't realize that in 400 years people might do the same exact thing to us. And I see a lot of people pushing back against this arrogance, pushing to recapture the mysteries of our faith, the mysteries of our theology, to have room for that in their relationship with God. Exploring paradox of recognizing that we are people with blinders on, and it's God who pulls those blinders back, not us. And especially as we approach God, especially as we come to the greatest mystery of all, we have so many things, just like the people of Jesus' day, that it's hard to wrap our heads around. And people are still people, whether it's 2,000 years ago or today. But to be open to this story, to be open to really hearing what's there for us, we need to let our blinders come off, to try to put on the perspective of a person, a Jewish person from the first century. You know, Jewish people did believe in resurrection. Most Jewish people believed in resurrection. They believed, unlike the other people of their time, in bodily resurrection. Not just spiritual rebirth, but physical rising from the dead. That doesn't mean that they thought they would see it in their lifetime. Doesn't mean that they would be easily fooled by charlatans claiming to have risen from the dead. You know, people who believed in resurrection, people like the Pharisees, believed in a general resurrection only. They believed there would only be one resurrection at the end of the age, where we would be called forth out of the ground to stand before our Maker and give an account for how we've lived our life. Another interesting popular belief in Jesus' time was the idea that if your body wasn't horribly injured, that within 3 days of dying from sickness like Lazarus did, that maybe it'd be possible that you could be resuscitated, that you could be brought back. And so it's important to hear this 4 days is a significant thing, because this is beyond the time the culture would say, no, time's up. It's beyond the time when it would be possible for someone to come back and wake back up and enter back into life. This person, after 4 days, would be as dead as they would ever be. And so, in pointing out the 4 days, we're really pointing out that this is beyond the realm of resuscitation. This is physical, bodily resurrection, just like the Jews were expecting at the end of the age. They weren't expecting it in that day. And so, for us, as a people who are waiting for the return of Jesus, as a people who are waiting for God to come into our lives, we have expectations and blinders that we wear. And despite sincere belief in the resurrection, so did the people of Jesus' day. No one would have predicted that even the Messiah could have raised someone from the dead. Jewish people were not silly, superstitious people who were easily fooled. They knew full well that when things died, they tended to stay dead. And it would take an action of God only that would change that. And they were just as shocked and surprised as Lazarus rose from the dead as they would be later when Jesus rose from the dead. Even seeing Lazarus rise from the dead wouldn't have softened the expectation, wouldn't have made it any more of an eye-opening, blinder-pulling-back experience. And so this is the place that Martha comes from in the story. She is speaking to Jesus. She comes from this Jewish perspective, that Jesus, as a healer, could have done something before Lazarus had died, but after that Lazarus would be in the hands of God. He would be beyond healing. When Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again," she only had one box for that. He would only rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Martha's limited view was blown apart in this experience. Despite being a very reasonable view, despite being a very biblical view, despite her expectations being normal for everyone, that once someone was dead, that they would stay that way. And so no one would have envisioned in that day Jesus in so many ways. No one envisioned a suffering Messiah. Even though Isaiah 53 painted that picture, no one expected that. Just like no one would envision a singular resurrection. Jesus uses Martha to show us a deep truth about ourselves, that despite strong faith and a deep knowledge of who Jesus is, there are still places that we're afraid to go. There are still places that God has yet to reveal that are beyond our understanding. Elements of the gospel story that we would want to throw out or short circuit. No, we want to skip to the end, to get to the good part. We want new life, but we don't want the old life to pass away. We want restoration and redemption, but we don't want the dying of self that has to go with that. Like Martha, we imagine how God will move in very limited ways, but we fail to see that the glory of God burns its brightest and best in things that are beyond our imagination, in the unexpected, beyond the boundaries that we impose on what God can do. And so faith is more than just believing the right things. It's trusting in God that God is at work, even in the most difficult situation, even when it doesn't look like we expect. But as we continue to look at who Jesus is in this series through the statements of John, we come to see this next claim about himself, that he claims to be the resurrection and the life. He says that those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? He asks. I think in our day, we have to ask ourselves that question too. Do we believe this? Do we let our hope come from that place? Jesus is the resurrection. He is the voice that calls the dead back to life. Whoever believes in him, despite going to the grave, will come to know eternal life. And those who do not believe him, as well as us who do, will hear that voice audibly one day as we stand before him in the great resurrection. And for those who have walked in obedience and listened to that voice, it will be a joyous occasion. It will be a warm reunion. We will have to give an account for our sin, but we will still experience that longing fulfilled. Jesus is the resurrection. He's the one who conquered death and hell and offers us grace instead of judgment. And by his resurrection, he showed the world that his claims about himself were true. By his resurrection, we see that God's hand was clearly at work, that we can build our lives on his teachings. We can know that death is not the end for us, that there is another chapter beyond that of our journey with God. And paradoxically, Jesus is more than just the power that calls us out of death. Jesus is the life. As important as the breath in our lungs, as important as the synapses firing in our brains. And whoever receives the gift of life through Jesus will never die a spiritual death, even though they die a physical death. For their life is extended beyond into the eternal. He gives us the gift of spiritual life. Spiritual life not only after death, but before death as well. And Jesus came to give us life in all its fullness, even eternal fullness. Like Lazarus received new life and freedom from physical death, we receive new life and freedom from spiritual death. We come to receive the gift of God's grace and mercy and love. And we find the power not only to die for God, but to live for God. To live lives bearing spiritual fruit. To enjoy not just the great beyond with God, but the here and now. And ultimately, this points to Jesus being our hope. Our life in this place is far more than just a prelude. But we can know that the best part really is still yet to come. We can know in partiality certain things about God, but in all its fullness that will be revealed to us when we stand before God face to face. So Jesus offers us more than just practice. He calls us to follow him, to take up our cross. He calls us to practice resurrection as we die to ourselves daily and allow God to form us in his image. He calls us to practice new life in him. Not just to believe the right things about Jesus, but to walk in his ways and to follow him. To do the things that he did. To let our minds be transformed like his. To see the world with eyes of grace. There are no shortcuts in the Christian life. God's grace is a grace that doesn't just pick us up and put us on our feet. It's a grace that expects us to walk with those feet. Expects us to follow Jesus to freedom. Like Lazarus, Jesus calls us out of our graves. He calls us out to help others, to come alongside them, and calls others to come alongside us, to help us to be unbound, unfettered, and free. His voice calls the church out to the suffering people he loves, to help roll back the stones of others, to fight through the fear that we might have of the stench of that work, and to walk back out into the world that seems so the same, but yet so different. And we as the church have no power at all to bring about miracles. We're like the people who freed Lazarus from his bandages. We are incidental, just the people that God uses in this place. But when we listen for the voice of God, when we obey that voice, when we trust that God is at work even beyond ourselves, even beyond our comfort zones, even when God reveals this unexpected journey that we aren't sure that we fully want to embrace, even there, when we listen to that voice and obey it, we can come to know Jesus as the resurrection and the life. We can come to know that death is a part of resurrection. We can come to know also a newness of life that no one can take away from us, not even the grave. So as we go into our time of open worship, I just want to invite you to think about your walk with God, about how God called you out, about how God is sending you out, about how God is giving you life. I think sometimes we get so distracted, so skeptical. We can't lay the blinders down, but if we reach out to God to do that for us, we can see that God is at work in new ways, that God wants to transform our whole perspective, and from that find newness of life. So wrestle with that as we go into this time of silence, and I just pray that you would encounter God in this time, a time of listening for God. And if you feel that it's a time of sharing what you have learned or what you have experienced, feel free to stand and a microphone will be brought to you.